This video will cover all of the basic components within the form builder and all of the unique features and settings each component offers. The text field is primarily used for text input, like a first or last name field on an application form. Use the text field when end users will input a short amount of text versus using the text area component when longer typed out summary responses might be required. Aside from text input, this component does offer some unique settings that can provide additional features and can change the way the component is utilized. Within the display settings, the field can be converted to a string-based calendar date picker by switching the widget type to calendar picker. Settings for the calendar widget, like the datetime format, can be configured by modifying the JSON within the widget settings. Using this component is a great alternative if you are needing a non-standardized datetime picker that does not convert the metadata to UTC. An input mask can also be configured to force predefined input formats when things like social security numbers are required. To apply an input mask, navigate to the Display tab and scroll down to the Input Mask setting. Here you can apply numeric, alpha, or alphanumeric formatting types. The text area is a multi-line text input field that provides the user with a large amount of space for the end user to type out more lengthy required responses. Settings like row configures the row height of the component, and auto expand will expand the text area as the user types into the field. This component can also be converted into a WYSIWYG editor by selecting the editor field. This editor provides the end user the ability to customize and tailor their text input. The number component is used for things like data calculation, percentages, scores, anything that requires the input data limited to numeric values. There are several unique settings within the Data tab that can change how the number values are structured. The thousand separator will force a decimal place in the correct thousandth position as the user inputs a number. Set the decimal amount by adding a value to the decimal places field. Check the required decimal place setting to force a decimal place for the number input. If a decimal place is not entered, the field will add zeros in the decimal place by default. The password field functions similarly as the text field, however the input type is set to password, which will automatically mask the data input on the front end. Backend security settings automatically encrypt the data and prevent the API from returning data. The checkbox component will be used for boolean values where the answer is either yes or no or true or false for things like terms and agreement verification field. The JSON data of the checkbox will save as either true when the component has been checked or false when the component is empty. The SelectBox component is a multi-value component that allows users to select one or more options in checkbox style format. Use the SelectBox component over the radio or select component when the user requires the flexibility to choose multiple options. Typically, static values are added to the component as selectable options for the end user. Validation can be set within the component settings to dictate the minimum and maximum number of options the user can check. So I have my maximum set to 2. Once I reach 2 options, the other options will disable. External data source endpoints can also be set to populate the option list from an external source. In this example, I have a color resource with 3 submissions, blue, yellow, red. I can navigate to my API endpoint for my color resource, grab the submission endpoint. I can then change my data source type from value to URL, plug the endpoint in, modify my item template so it's referencing the correct field within my resource. And I now have a dynamic database of my color resource that I can pull from for my Checkbox component. Other JSON-based data sources outside the Form.IO environment can also be used. The select component displays a list of values within a drop-down list the end user can select from. In addition to a multitude of settings to filter, query, and load the select values, the form designer also has the flexibility to select how and where these values originate from by modifying the data source type setting. When value is set, the static options are added to the component the end user will select from. When URL is set, an external URL endpoint containing JSON data can be added to the component to provide values. In this example, I have a JSON object containing US states that will populate within my dropdown. I can add my endpoint here. And I'm going to scroll down to the item template and make sure I'm using the correct JSON property I want to display within my dropdown. So I'm going to use the name property within this list. And when I click my dropdown, I can see all of the US states within my dropdown. When resource is set, submission data of a resource within the Form.IO project can be used to populate the dropdown. In this example, I have a color resource with a list of color submissions. When configured, these color submissions can be used as values for my select dropdown for my end users. Using resources is a great way to establish a source of truth for a data set, allowing the form designer to connect components across a multitude of forms to one data source type. Anytime the resource data is updated, all connected components will update dynamically via API. Set the data source type to raw JSON to provide your own custom JSON values. JSON can be used over static values to save time adding and updating select options. Finally, custom code can be used to return the value options or a promise with the value option. The radio component is another value selection component that will present a set of static values and allows the user to select only one of the predefined options in button format. Similar to the select box in the select component, the data source for the radio component can also be changed to an external source. In this example, I have a JSON endpoint containing a list of US states. The URL can be added to the radio component settings and display the US states as selectable options. Just need to make sure and set the item template correctly. There we go. This can also be done with resources within your project. The button component can facilitate different actions or events on the form. While the most basic function of the button component is to submit the form, the button can also be used to trigger events associated with workflow logic. For example, I have a calculate button that will send off an event called test whenever the button is clicked. I have a total field that's listening for that event, and when it's heard, it will calculate the values of field A and field B and total them into this total field. So I go and use this form. I'm going to add data to field A and field B, click calculate to send off the event, and the logic is executed. The button component can also be used to reset field data on your form. We've already talked about it obviously being used for a submit button. And the button component can also be used to authenticate end users into OAuth or SAML authentication providers.